I just want to say I dressed a little casually tonight. I think he would be so much against it if I had put on a tie, and I have my little Listening to America shirt on. And that's sort of why I'm talking about Edward Abbey. As I look at America, not just in my own lifetime, but for the past 250 years, I'm sort of going back to some things that I know well, and looking particularly at things from this era, the 60s and 70s, because it was such an extraordinary era in American history. And so I've been rereading Kerouac, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. I absolutely love Kerouac's On the Road, but it becomes increasingly problematic, and I'll come back to that. I watched Easy Rider recently. It holds up pretty well. You only blush a handful of times. I've been listening to and watching the video version of Woodstock, which really never grows old. It's just so extraordinary. Joe Cocker singing A Little Help from My Friends. And I started rereading Edward Abbey. I read Edward Abbey 20 or 30 years ago, and now I'm reading him in a big way. I have new connections in the southwest of Colorado and in Utah, and I've been to Moab recently, and really just finding him utterly compelling. And one of my themes tonight is if you think he was upset about the way we treat the West then, imagine if he were with us now. We need such voices. It doesn't mean that we necessarily agree with such voices, but we need to have those voices in the mix. And he was often a provocateur. He wanted to stir, he wanted to shock you, he wanted to startle you, he wanted to upset you, he wanted to offend you. And he didn't always believe what he said, but it would be a mistake ever to think that he didn't believe those things that he said too. He was a self-styled anarchist, and he meant it, as you'll see. So I just want to get a couple of propositions on the table, but let me start this way. This is from the beginning of Desert Solitaire. I like to sit on the sill of my doorway, bare feet planted on the bare ground and a mug of hot coffee in hand, facing the sunrise. He had a little funky little trailer at Arches National Monument, 1957. The air is gelid, not far above freezing, but the butane heater inside the trailer keeps my back warm. Rising sun warms the front and the coffee warms the interior. So you can already see that he's a great writer. And so I said to those of you who were here last night that I've unfortunately been tripped into ChatGPT, and now I do nothing but create imagery. And look at this. Is that great? So the trailer was right by Balanced Rock, and there he is on the steps having his morning beer. And he talks about this rattlesnake that lived there, and he was okay with it as long as it didn't, get too feisty. So I think that is a really fine, of course I had nothing to do with it, but it's a really fine image of Edward Abbey. And it shows you also the enormous vitality of him, which works in several directions, as you'll see. Within this vast perimeter, in the middle ground and foreground of the picture, a rather personal domain, in other words, my personal fiefdom, are 33,000 acres of Arches National Monument, of which I am now the sole inhabitant, usufructuary, observer, and custodian. So here's my argument. I'll get it on the table right away so that if we run out of time, I do want your questions, and we want to hear from those of you who were here when he was here in 1974. These are my words. Edward Abbey was a fierce advocate and protector of the wilderness, especially the American Southwest. And maybe in some respects, he was the first great nationally recognized advocate of the Southwest. He engaged in some monkey wrenching, a term by the way which he invented, but he insisted that wilderness protectors should avoid damaging humans. If you want to blow up a dam, that's fine. Burn down a few billboards, sure. But don't damage people. This has to be property damage only. He was deeply indebted to Henry David Thoreau, and that's really one of my themes tonight. I think that everyone pays lip service to this, and he wrote a famous essay, which I'll look at, called Down the River with with Henry Thoreau. It's one of his very finest essays. But I think that the connection, his debt to Thoreau, has been largely overlooked. This is when I say rethinking Edward Abbey, that's one of the themes, that his debt to Thoreau needs to be much more thoroughly investigated, and I'll give a few examples of it here. But this is something that I'm really concerned about. He calls it Desert Solitaire. In other words, alone in the desert. He wanted solitude, but in fact, he actually needed a nearby woman, possibly his wife. He was married 5 times. He had innumerable lovers, and he flirted with almost every woman he met. I don't think that's, I mean, obviously we have to factor that in as we try to rethink him in an age when we're much more sensitive to that sort of, what I guess you in some sense call predation. But it's not my main concern, and I'll try to show that. And this is really important too. We think of, you know, if you've read him, if you think about him, if you've sort of heard of him, he has a reputation as this fierce anarchist, desert rat, floater of rivers, antagonist to government and development, critic of the national park system, and so on. And we recognize mostly now his essays, Desert Solitaire, which is a sort of long essay or memoir, but we also, of course, read Monkey Wrench Gang, which is really an essay pretending to be a novel. But I've been reading his journals, which I highly recommend. This is a small anthology of a journal that he kept all of his life. It's called Confessions of a Barbarian, which I quibble with. When I've read a lot of Abbey, when I picked this book up last year, I thought, I'm not going to like this book. If you just said Confessions of Edward Abbey, that's what this book is, and I'll come back to that. But he really, and he says this again and again, he really wanted to be a novelist. His dream was to be a great novelist, to write the great American novel, or at least the great American novel of the Southwest. And he wrote a bunch of them, but we don't really think of him as a novelist. We think of him as Edward Abbey, the provocateur, the anarchist, and the essayist. And then this was sort of an epitaph. If my decomposing carcass helps nourish the roots of a juniper tree or the wings of a vulture, that is immortality enough for me and as much as anyone deserves. And he actually said that he wanted to come back as a vulture. So here are 3 Edward Abbey books to read and an essay. Desert Solitaire, A Season in the Wilderness, 1968, same year as the Beatles' Abbey Road. Confessions of a Barbarian, selections from the journals, that was published posthumously. His papers are at the University of Arizona at Tucson. And The Monkey Wrench Gang, the notorious novel, 1975. But if you don't have time for those and you just want to read one thing this weekend, read Down the River with Henry Thoreau. And I think you will be drawn right in. Larry McMurtry, the great Texas critic, bookseller, and himself novelist, and a great one, much better than Abbey, frankly, called Abbey the Thoreau of the West. And I think Abbey would reject that with scorn and anger, because it's reductionist. It limits him. He doesn't want to be limited. He doesn't want to be pigeonholed. He doesn't want you to decide who he was. Here's sort of what it looked like in that time, if I can get this to work. It's a little pixelated because it's a snapshot from a Kodak Brownie camera. Arches National Monument was created in 1929. And I'll show you some statistics in a little while. There were almost no visitors. I think there were 30,000 visitors when Abbey was the ranger there. And he said, it is monstrously overcrowded. That's way too many people. Yeah, so I'll show you. And here again, this is where the trailer was. And I was there last year with friends. And we spent a lot of time looking for where the trailer was. Unfortunately, the trailer is no longer. But there it is. And this is what we're talking about. This is what he calls Abbey country. Grandiose, desolate, shamelessly spectacular. You're used to it out here. I'm not. I'm a North Dakotan, so we have nothing. We have nothing like this. You're used to it here, but look at that photograph. It makes your knees sag to see a photograph, and of course, much better to actually be in that space. How about that? And he says this, the Colorado River, the heart of the American West. Here he is, kind of a classic Abbey portrait. And this great statement: wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and as vital to our lives as water and good bread. A civilization which destroys what little remains of the wild, the spare, the original, is cutting itself off from its origins and betraying the principle of civilization itself. Isn't that marvelous? How many of you think that's true? And so I'm not going to be, I don't want to be political tonight. We got a little of that last night. Couldn't help talking about the Constitution and the Supreme Court at this moment. We didn't intend to be political. We just intended to look at the Constitution. But if this is true, most of you raised your hands, then we're so fortunate. We are deeply fortunate that we have not just formal wilderness under the Wilderness Act, but essential wilderness in Utah and Nevada and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona and California and so on. What country in Europe would you go to see their wilderness? Not England, not France, not Germany. We are uniquely fortunate. Now, I want to just say before I go any farther that when you talk about this way, you always have to remember that we, the Euro-Americans, came in and displaced the indigenous people. And that's something that, it's like we have to always have that right there in our brain whenever we talk this way, because this was land sovereign to indigenous peoples that had been here for millennia. So I don't want us to forget that for a moment. But from a Euro-American point of view, thinking someone like Thomas Jefferson or John Muir, the West was sort of the Garden of Eden that had been preserved against the tragedy of European history. And we were going to see this primordial landscape that we mistakenly thought had not been in any way developed, which isn't true. But that's what it has signified in American life. And the great news is that some of it is so rugged, so remote, so arid, that we have preserved it. And if this were Iowa, we wouldn't have done it. You know why? Because it rains there. How about this for my ChatGPT life? You go home and play with this thing. It's like catnip. And see, then you tell it what you want. I said I want a horizontal painting of Edward Abbey, with his hands in his pockets, looking over the Grand Canyon, and I want the geology to have an echo of Holmes, the great illustrator of the Grand Canyon in the West. Then it sends me a version. Then it says, do you want to edit this? And then I say, well, yeah, he should be scowling, or yeah, his beard's a little too dark. And for a while, it'll do this for you. And then it finally says, that's sort of it. So when I said that I dislike the title of Confessions of a Barbarian, here's why. This belongs to a really, really distinct Western literary tradition. St. Augustine's Confessions is regarded as the first great autobiography written in the 5th century CE, AD. And then in the 18th century, the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These are two of the great masterpieces of the confessional mode. Abbey's Confessions are not organized as a full and integrated book, but when you read this, you learn an enormous amount about Edward Abbey, and it takes you out of that trap of thinking him only as the beer-swilling provocateur. He writes about himself, he writes about love, sex, friendship, literature, American history. He writes about his own craft and how desperate he is to be a great writer. This is a book that you will want to have as a companion book if you decide you want to get interested in Abbey. Here's the achievement: 8 novels, many books of essays, scattered essays that have never been published, and then, of course, his journals. And all the manuscripts, as I said, are in Tucson. Now, the monkey wrencher. He invented this term, and the monkey wrench gang is about a small group of people who decide to take back the West from industrial development by pouring molasses and sugar and sand into the gasoline tanks of bulldozers and tearing out their hydraulics and running them over cliffs. And their goal is to blow up Glen Canyon Dam. They don't, as we all know, but it was a fantasy. And I'll come back to Glen Canyon Dam in a moment. But in the monkey wrench gang, there is a prohibition on damaging human beings personally. We will not kill or hurt others, however much we regard them as the enemy. But property, you bet. And the book opens by introducing the characters. There are only a few of them. And this couple from Albuquerque goes out on the weekends and cuts down billboards on the highways. They find a billboard, they cut it down with a chainsaw. If they can't cut it down, they pour kerosene on it and burn it. And this is their way to strike back at the industrial development. And here, of course, is Glen Canyon Dam, one of the great achievements of the industrial development of the American West. If you're an environmentalist, or if you're a conservationist, or if you're fascinated by the history of conservation, this is the #1 open sore in the conservation world. You probably know that David Brower of the Sierra Club decided that we must save Dinosaur National Monument, and he made a strategic trade that if you will spare us flooding a national monument, we can probably learn to live with the dam in Glen Canyon. And for the rest of his life, he said, that was the #1 mistake I ever made. And in the environmental movement, bringing this dam down would be the greatest triumph and vindication that they could possibly imagine. And it might happen now, as you know, with the prolonged drought in the Southwest and the overallocation of the Colorado River. In other words, there are more people that have legal claims on it every year than the water can even supply in average years, and certainly not in drought years. Because of that, there are many distinguished hydrologists, not environmentalists, who say that you can have one or the other. You can have Hoover Dam or Glen Canyon Dam. You can have Lake Mead or you can have Lake Powell, but you cannot continue to have both. You will never be able to refill them, because even if we have wet years, they are so over-allocated that it simply doesn't work to have two. And to have two giant reservoirs like this just creates evaporation possibilities that you don't want to have. You want to limit the number of surface feet if you can. So let's make Lake Mead as deep as we can, and then let's either bring Glen Canyon Dam down to Lake Powell down to a manageable size, or open the gates altogether. There is a very good chance that this will happen in the lifetime of my daughter. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but 15 years ago, people would have said, no, this will never happen. But now the hydrology and the conditions of the environment in the American West, global climate change and so on, are dictating a fresh look at that. And that would be for, if you think of like protests against no kings and all that, if this went down, I believe 1 million people would be there. And there would be dancing and orgiastic wonders, and there would be, you can imagine that this would be like considered a pivotal moment in the future history of America and the West. So here's Abbey at the dam. And here's what he said: there is no shortage of water in the desert, but exactly the right amount. Hard for us to accept that. There's no shortage of water in the desert, exactly the right amount. A perfect ratio of water to rock, of water to sand, ensuring wide, free, open, generous spacing among plants and animals, homes, towns, and cities, which makes them, the arid West, so different from any other part of the nation. There's no lack of water here, unless you try to establish a city where no city should be, by which he means Phoenix. Phoenix without the great projects could probably support a population of 500,000 or so. In Desert Solitaire, a couple from Ohio says, this is such a great monument, Arches National Monument. It's just a pity that it doesn't rain. And Abbey said, if it rained, you wouldn't be here. And so you probably know that this was not Abbey. But in 1981, Earth First, which was inspired in some respects by Abbey, put down this crack. This was a very long plastic sheet to symbolize the eventual breach of the dam. It raised enormous controversy because the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation said, don't give any hints out. And here it is today, as you know, if you've been there lately, it's much diminished, and that's the so-called bathtub ring. And Abbey said, Lake Powell, storage pond, silt trap, evaporation tank, garbage disposal, a 180-mile-long incipient sewage lagoon. People who love Lake Powell say it's one of the jewels of the world, but Abbey thought it was an obscene destruction of one of the most beautiful and gentle canyons in America. Here he is. Beautiful, beautiful portrait of him. Left-handed writing. The Bibles of the conservation movement, there are many, but these are, in my opinion, the principal ones. I'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about Thoreau's Walden tonight. Of course, John Muir, it's not clear which is his greatest book. He doesn't have a single greatest book, but My First Summer in the Sierra, certainly. Aldo Leopold's a Sand County Almanac. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, and then, of course, Edward Abbey, Desert Solitaire. How many of you read all four? Five. How many of you read a couple of them? That's great. So now, I guess it's time for you to... How many have read Walden? Oh, that's good news. When he was here in 1974, he said something like this. He said a version of this. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and animals. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Take your hat off to no man. He says, I'm in the stifling heat of the trailer, opening a can of beer, barefooted, about to go outside and relax after a hard day, watching cloud formations. This is a very Thoreauvian moment, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So, all right, so you kind of get a picture of him, don't you? Beautiful writer, deeply advocating a certain view of the West, provocative, willing to go a little too far on all occasions. So what's the rap against Edward Abbey? There is one, and I just want to go through a little, and they're important. These are the kind of things that can get you canceled in our time. He has an insensitive and often racist attitude about Native Americans, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans. I mean, at times excruciating. In Desert Solitaire. He was a border closer. He wanted to keep people from Central and South America out. For a conservationist, he threw a lot of trash on the highways. He used to throw beer cans on the highways because he said, this is my commentary on the American highway system. He also is said to have taken a burning tire and pushed it over the lip of the north rim of the Grand Canyon. That did happen, but it was probably in another canyon. And of course, there is the problem of Edward Abbey and women. Here he says, in Monkey Wrench Gang, his novel, their beer cans sailed light as Dixie cups into the gloom of the gorge. He says that with joy. You know, it kind of rubs us the wrong way. Also, though, and this gets a little more, well, it's all serious, but this I think is really worth thinking about too. He makes it seem as if anyone can wander about the wilderness safely and with confidence. And I'll come back to that, but Amy Irvine, an essayist and writer in Moab, has written a book answering some of this. And she says, if there's ever white male privilege in 1968, that's it. And I don't know how all of you feel, but most people feel that a woman alone in a desert place is vulnerable in ways that a man alone in a desert place may not be. And she says, I don't really care about all the women. Yeah, it's not a great thing, but in some sense, it's none of my business. But his sense of that he owns at what he calls Abbey country, and that he thinks that every person who has any gumption should be out there alone. Well, she says that's very presumptuous, and only a white male of a certain type could make that argument. Also, and I've already alluded to this, how much was he really alone? He says he's alone. He makes a big deal out of it. In his classic book, in the title says Desert Solitaire. It doesn't say desert, sometimes with one of my wives and often with girlfriends. And this is, I think, a serious issue, because when he presents himself as alone, this kind of reinvigorates the American tradition of the rugged individualist. And you'll see that Amy Irvine says that's not how the West was really developed at all. And she says, and I'm just paraphrasing here, and how does his posture of aloneness and being solitary perpetuate something toxic in the formation of American males? And I think there's a lot to that, at least to debate. All right, so I have two slides here. This is his view of, one of his views of the border. Close it, shut them out. The one thing we could do for a country like Mexico, for example, is to stop every illegal immigrant at the border, give him a good rifle and a case of ammunition, and send him home. Let the Mexicans solve their customary problems in their customary way. So I put on Facebook a couple of weeks ago that I was going to be coming here, and I was going to be giving this talk. And all I said was I'm going to be giving this talk. Here's what somebody posted: anarchist, eco-terrorist, racist, sexist, adulterer, alcoholic. I'm curious what you are rethinking. Can you hear the snark? It's just like, don't you hate Facebook? I mean, no matter what you post, within 2 or 3 threads, people just start to unload whatever is deep in their spirit. And because MM could be Mary Madeline or Mount Marty or Mike Mitchell. Anonymity gives people the right to say absolutely anything without evidence. This is my cartoon that I made, which it's not great art, but it does sort of illustrate something. Here he is. That's a very typical Abbey pose. You can see he's in the desert. All right, so Desert Solitaire. That word has really come to haunt me a little bit, and I'll show you why. But here is another one of my ChatGPTs. He often went into the bars of Moab. After he would have his week, go into the bars of Moab, and he loved to have beer with working class people, miners, ranch hands, cowboys, and so on. And so I had this done. You can see the Geiger counter there, and people love to hear it. He was a charismatic, and people absolutely loved to hear Edward Abbey hold forth on whatever subject he was holding forth on. All right, so when I was in Moab recently, I went to Back of Beyond bookstore. I don't know how many of you have been to that. It's one of the great bookstores in America. And let's just give a hand to independent bookstores. And the owners, I was looking at a table, which was Edward Abbey's writing table, and they had a fat manuscript. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, that's the manuscript of Desert Solitaire." It was a copy. And I said, "How would one get a chance to take a look at that?" You try to say it in the most innocent way, in case you later steal it. And he said, "Well, I've got another one in the back. I'll give it to you if you just send it back." And so I don't want to sound too confessional here, but the chances that I was going to send that back approached 0. So as soon as I got back to North Dakota, I took it immediately to a kind of Kinko's and had it immediately copied, and I immediately put it in the mail because that was the only way he was ever going to see it again. But I want to show you something about this. And so I've got the whole manuscript, and it tells you a great deal about Abbey. I haven't finished studying it, but I intend to publish an essay or maybe a monograph about the manuscript in the book, you can see how heavily he edited it. And this is his foreword, and I just want to show you this. So look here on this, the second paragraph. My job began on, this is the manuscript, not the published book. My job began on the first day of April and ended on the last day of September. I liked the Arches so much I returned a second 6 months hitch the following year, that time with my wife and our first son, and I might be there yet except that the government and the tourist industry began to improve and develop the area. Okay, that was what he wrote. And it's true. His first child was born while he was alone as a ranger at Arches and went to Albuquerque to sort of check in. And in the second year, he brought his wife and his son there with him. Here's what, so by the time he gets to publish the book, he wants to create the illusion, the trope that he was really alone out there. So watch what he does. My job began on the 1st of April and ended on the last day of September. I like to work in the canyon country, returned the following year for a second. I would have returned a third year too. No wife, no son. And each year thereafter, but unfortunately for me, the Arch is a primitive place and so on. In other words, he wrote his wife and his son out of the manuscript. So I just imagine her reading the book. Oh, I don't even appear in this book, huh? You were solitaire, were you? And so I'm just going to show you a few of these pages. You see how heavily he reworked. He wasn't Jack Kerouac just knocking it out. He rewrote very seriously and went over this manuscript many, many times. And so now there are printers, or rather scanners, that can see behind that which is blacked out. So I'm going to try to rent access to one and try to figure out what words are so unwanted that he made sure they were blacked out forever. So you see, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary to be able to see a great creative writer's process as a writer. And each page will now reveal new ways of thinking about what he wanted to emphasize, what he wanted to play down, what he changed when he was listening to it or hearing others talk about it. So just a couple more. So this is a treasure, and if any of you wants to see it, let me know, and I can try to help you see parts of it. All right, this is an actual photograph of Abbey out there. So one of the greatest arguments of Desert Solitaire is that the national parks are overcrowded, too many cars, too many tourists, too many stupid tourists, doing damaging things and asking stupid questions like there's a book about the stupidest questions asked at Yellowstone. For example, is there anything to see here? This is true. Is there anything to see here? Or how long will it take me to see here? And you can't even believe the questions that get asked. But my favorite is actually from Shiloh National Park. And a tourist came there, a woman, and said, why is it that so many Civil War battles occurred in national parks? Well, Johnny Reb loved the parks. Anyway, you should take a look at the books about the stupid things that people say and the stupid things that people do. Another person was gored by a buffalo here recently in Yellowstone. All right, so loving the national parks to death. And again, if you think that he was right then, just wait. So here we have it's like family vacation, National Lampoon, where they get out at the North Rim and Chevy Chase says, all right, only 400 miles to the world's largest ball of twine. How many of you have seen congestion in the national parks? Yeah, exactly. Look at this. Breaks your heart. Look at these. I looked up these statistics this week. 1929, 500 visitors to Arches. When he was there in 1957, 25,000 visitors. When he died in 1989, 555,000 visitors. 2000, 786, and last year, 2 years ago, 865 visitors. Imagine what he would say now if he was appalled by 28,000 people. And this is what I found on the website. It's like trying to get into Delmonico's in New York. All right. If he was right back then, imagine. So, I wrongly have this as Thoreau. Abbey's prescription for the national parks is 3 points. No more cars. That's it. You park on giant parking lots at the edge of the park. Buses and other excursion vehicles will take you in. No more cars. That was 1968. And of course, Denali and several others now have experimented with that, or combinations of it. Number 2, no more roads in the national parks. And he was writing this, if you're interested in the history of the national park system, just 2 years after something called Project 66, and Project 66 was on the 50th anniversary of the Organic Act that created the national park system in 1916. And it was a colossal plan to build visitor centers and outhouses and new roads and new campgrounds and new this and new that, because the Park Service needs to accommodate user interest. And Abbey saw what was coming, that the national parks were going to have a huge tourist recreational infrastructure, and that this was going to put almost unbearable pressure on the park experience. And then finally, this is what really upsets the park ranger class. He said, put them to work. All they do is drive around. Get them out there, have them lead hikes, have them really do something instead of just cleaning up the latrines from time to time. And he said, industrial tourism is a threat to the national parks, but the chief victims of the system are the motorized tourists. They're being robbed and robbing themselves so long as they are unwilling to crawl out of their cars. Crawl is an interesting word. Out of their cars, they will not discover the treasures of the national parks and will never escape the stress and turmoil of the urban-suburban complexes which they had hoped, presumably, to leave behind for a while. Think of that. This is 1968. We're talking in 2025, when there's an exponential greater pressure on the parks. Now, let's just quickly look at this question. Abbey and women. 5 wives, innumerable lovers, endless flirtations. And his 5th wife, Clark, who's still alive in Moab, whom he began to have a relationship when she was 15. He was in his 50s. And he married her when she finally became 18. She said this, don't make him into a mystical hero. He was damn real and a very... I'll bet she knows whereof she speaks. And here's what he said in his confessions, in his journal. I'm hoping none of the wives saw this. Sex, not much. A mistress in Italy, a wife in America, a sweetheart in the desert, and a few semi-whores here and there. So this is the kind of thing that can get you canceled. And look at just what an extraordinarily handsome and charismatic man he was. He was irresistible, apparently. And he knew it, and he used it. So this is a cheesy little cartoon I made. He played the flute. Again, I don't think that this is the critical issue. There are more important issues. But you can't ignore this issue. And so it's a paradox, and I'll show you why. So what should these bad boys, what should we do with them? So here are Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac. When I first read, how many of you have read On the Road? When I first read it when I was in high school and college, I was just like, oh, I can't wait to get out on the road, and across the country in Greyhound buses and hitchhike and meet all these women and all these really extraordinary people and walk the streets of Denver and so on. And I never noticed that these guys were like unbelievable sexual predators, especially Neil Cassidy. And so now when you read it, and I wrote an essay about this last year, now when you read it, it just takes a little of the wind out of you, because you realize there's a psychopathology to Neil Cassidy, not so much for Jack Kerouac, but that's something it still happens, of course, but we have infinitely less tolerance for this sort of thing today, as we should. And so now when you read this, there's a shadow over the joyful, youthful exuberance of these books. And of course, it was a different era, and I don't want to be judgmental, but in some sense, when you read it now, it sticks in your throat a little bit. So Amy Irvine lives in Moab, here she is, and she wrote this book, a slender book called Desert Cabal, a new season in the wilderness. And she's not, and again, she says it's not about all the women. That's icky, but this is not what that's about. She wants to reread him in other ways, and this is what bothers her first. He says in Desert Solitaire, in the center of the world, God's navel, Abbey's country. She says, why do you get to call it Abbey's country? Isn't that extractive too? Isn't that appropriative too? Aren't you owning the desert and calling it your own, that you are the protector of it and so on? That's offensive for you to speak that way. And then she says this: these good white liberals today want monuments in wilderness to protect the places they recreate, to keep out companies that want to suck the fossil fuels out from under the sandstone. But the oil and gas will be burned by and large by them to travel to Utah's public lands, and it's used by us, you and your big red Cadillac and me and my Toyota truck, although I've recently downgraded to a more fuel-efficient Subaru, the preferred method of transport that's most often frosted with bike, ski, and boat racks for the outdoor enthusiasts across the nation. So in other words, she's exaggerating a little bit. Her point is, you're complicit too. Don't pretend you're not complicit in this problem. And then she says this, again, this is her, not him. This is the grand illusion that we were once whole. That's the sort of Edenic myth of the American West, that our ecosystems were intact. And of course, the view is that Native Americans were like super ecologists and lived in perfect harmony with the universe, self-sustaining, that everything we need is within, and to need others is as vampiric as drilling for every last drop of oil. Sort of, that's Abbey's view of the world. If this is why we seek solitude, we are in danger of extinction. And so here she is again. I'm going to skip over a couple because I want to get to your questions. But her view is, we prize Marlboro Man and John Wayne and so on. But the West was not developed by rugged individualists. They were out there, and of course we have a wonderful, beautiful, romantic mythology of them, but it's toxic because the West was actually developed by communities, by people coming together and building a church, building a school, creating law and order, developing a community themselves, and it took cooperation against the very severe challenges of living in desert country, and communities had to do this. It couldn't be done just by these desperados that we love to mythologize. Let's take that out for now. All right, so I want to go to Thoreau here for a minute. How deep does it run? So I want to look at a couple of things, and I may not get to all of them, but I want to just convince you that he was much more indebted to Thoreau than he admits. And I love that, because Thoreau is I'll just speak very personally, is my favorite American author. In my view, if there were only one American book, it would have to be Walden. I teach Walden. I struggle teaching Walden because almost everybody who comes to my Walden retreat says, yeah, but he took his laundry to town, and therefore missing the point of Walden. But here's what he says. This is in the first chapter of Desert Solitaire. And see if you hear echoes. I am here not only to evade for a while the clamor and filth and confusion of the cultural apparatus, but also to confront immediately and directly, if possible, the bare bones of existence, the elemental and fundamental, the bedrock which sustains us. I want to be able to look at and into a juniper tree, a piece of quartz, a vulture, a spider, and see it as it is in itself, devoid of all humanly ascribed qualities, anti-Kantian, even the categories of scientific description. To meet God or Medusa face to face, even if it means risking everything human in myself. I dream of a hard and brutal mysticism in which the naked self emerges with a non-human world and yet somehow survives still intact, individual, separate, paradox, and bedrock. Beautiful. His mission statement. And here's what Thoreau said. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life, living is so dear, nor to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish that meanness to the world. But if it were sublime, to know that by experience and to be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. In my opinion, there is nothing better than that in American literature. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. Now that I'm an old man, I think the line that bothers me most is, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Doesn't that resonate? Not when I came to die, discover that I had not. You see that Abbey is clearly riffing on this great passage. He doesn't say he is, but he is. And I have gone through Desert Solitaire now with a Thoreau lens on and found literally scores of Thoreau allusions, references, and so on. Only a few acknowledged, not that he needs to. All right, so here is my... Huh? I tell you, in The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman is told plastics. My view to you in Vail is invest in ChatGPT. If you can do this as some knucklehead in Bismarck, North Dakota in a 12-minute segment on a Thursday night, we're doomed. So, yeah. And look at that, I did that too. This is, of course, Thoreau at Walden Fishing, the famous passage in which he goes into this kind of fugue state. He's got his fishing line and it's 40 feet down in the water, and he's kind of dreaming, and the moon is out. I had them add a moon in the next version. And then he's just kind of drifting into this kind of cosmogony. And then he says he just feels a tiny little twitch on the line. And it pulls him back down to earth. And he says, thus I had caught two fishes with one line. I caught cosmic consciousness and that perch. Oh, I love it. How about this? After lunch, this is when he's being shown around. After lunch, we get into the cab at the government pickup, all three of us, and tour the park. Arches National Monument remains at this time what the Park Service calls an undeveloped area, although it appears quite adequately developed. That reversal, undeveloped, developed, there are 15 or 20 such sentences in Walden. Thoreau does exactly the same thing. Look at this. This is right off the front in his first chapter on economy. I should not obtrude my affairs so much on the notice of my readers if very particular inquiries had not been made by my townsmen concerning my mode of life, which some would call impertinent. In other words, some would say it's impertinent to quiz Thoreau about his mode of life. But he says, no, although they do not appear to me at all impertinent, but considering the circumstances, very natural and pertinent. So it's the same logical twist. And he's picked that up from Thoreau and he uses it again and again. All right, now, just a few more things here. American individualism, remember, Amy Irvine, I think, rightly says, yes, that's an element in American life, but let's not aggrandize it in the way we once did, because there is a toxicity there, and it is also something of a lie about the way the West was developed. Abbey was an anarchist. He wrote his master's thesis on anarchy. And that master's thesis from the University of New Mexico was about whether it's ever right to use violence in anarchy. You probably know Thoreau's great essay on civil disobedience, and here's Abbey on a similar sort of line. My moral allegiance to a given state now he defines it, and the state is the body of men in law and power which composes and comprises the government, is directly proportional in degree to the extent to which the state senses my needs, and inversely proportional to the extent to which the state violates or disregards my ends, needs, or principles. Here's Abbey the anarchist, famously shot a television. That'll end the media. Yeah. And here he is again. Kind of like a glamour portrait of Edward Abbey. And here he says, anarchism is not a romantic fable, but the hard-headed realization based on 5,000 years of experience that we cannot entrust the management of our lives to kings, priests, politicians, generals, and county commissioners. Hey-ho, hey-ho. And he says, question authority. Reads a bumper sticker I saw the other day in Moab. Thoreau would doubtless have amended that to read always question authority. And I would add only the word all before authority. Always question all authority, including, of course, the authority himself, Henry David. So just to trace this just for a moment, Jefferson is said to have said that government is best that governs least. Thoreau is sort of the next step. This is from Civil Disobedience. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe, that government is best which governs not at all. So governs least, Jefferson, governs not at all, Thoreau, and when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which we will have. And when we mature into full, self-realized, self-actualized, enlightened human beings, no government will be necessary. Until then, let's limit it. And here's sort of a chart, Jefferson, Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and there's Edward Abbey, prophets of nonviolent resistance. And the progenitor of much of it is not Jefferson, but Thoreau. Gandhi acknowledged Thoreau, Martin Luther King acknowledged Thoreau, and Abbey in his own way does. Here's what he says in his last book. When I see somebody coming to do me good, I reach for my revolver. Typical Abbey. He doesn't mean it, of course. But here's what Thoreau said. You think he didn't get this from Thoreau? If I knew, this is one of my favorite sentences in Thoreau, if I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with the conscious design of doing me some good, I should run for my life. I love that. I think it's true, too. So, but you see that Abbey is not acknowledging it, but he is clearly riffing and echoing on Thoreau. Just going to do a couple more. That horse, he's talking about a horse that got away. I'm thinking maybe the one that got away from me several years ago in another desert place far from here, leave it alone. Thoreau says, in a famous passage in the first chapter of Walden, I long ago lost a hound, a bay horse, and a turtle dove, and am still on their trail. Many are the travelers I have spoken concerning them, and so on. That is the most heavily annotated passage in Thoreau because nobody knows what that means, hound, bay horse, and turtle dove. But that's Thoreau. All right, so he goes on this journey down the river, and you'll see in a minute, he took a copy of Walden with him. And he loves Thoreau. He admires him. He's clearly so deeply indebted to Thoreau. But you know what he can't stand about Thoreau? Thoreau was celibate. And he says, how can you be a complete man? Excuse my English here, but how can you be a complete man if you're not getting laid from time to time? He says, this ascetic, this Puritan, this withdrawal from his mammalian life sufficiently discredits Thoreau. We still love him, but there's something wrong with him if he doesn't believe in human passionate relationships. And he, at one point in Higher Laws, Thoreau says, at a certain point, any mature man would never eat meat again because it makes us bestial. And Abbey's view is, medium rare, please. Says, I do not approve of his fastidious Puritanism. For one who claims to crave nothing but reality, he frets too much about purity. Purity, purity, he preaches in the most unctuous of his many sermons, a chapter in Walden called Higher Laws. Then he says later, now, he goes on this trip carrying a copy of Walden with a bunch of other people, including his latest squeeze. And he talks about Thoreau all through this 7 or 8 day trip. But he never once mentions that they talked about it around the fire. It's Abbey and Thoreau when he's off alone, but he never says, I brought this to the attention of my colleagues and we had a really interesting conversation. It's Abbey Solitaire wrestling with Thoreau. And then he says this, Henry gazes, he's all alone at the fire. He's always up before the others and he always stays up after the others on this camping trip. Was it true? Unclear. But he wants you to see him as alone. Henry, they're on a first name basis, gazes at me through the flames of the campfire from beyond the Vail. Edward, he says, what are you doing here? Henry, I reply, what are you doing out there? But in Civil Disobedience, there is a famous passage where, you remember when Thoreau goes to jail for not paying his taxes? And Ralph Waldo Emerson comes by and says, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau says, Ralph, what are you doing out there? It's another echo of that book. Instead of mountain men, we are cursed. This is again from Down the River. Instead of mountain men, we are cursed with a plague of diggers, drillers, borers, grubbers, of asphalt spreaders, dam builders, overgrazers, clear cutters, and strip miners, whose object seems to be to make our mountains match our men, making molehills out of the mountains for a race of rodents. For the rat race. That's powerful. And I've been also reading John McPhee's Encounters with the Archdruid. I don't know how many of you know that book, but David Brower has to face three others in different situations, and they all say David Brower of the Sierra Club, and they say, well, do you have paint on your house? I wonder where that was manufactured. And do you heat your house in the winter? Oh, I wonder where that energy came from. And they, it's kind of a creepy Socratic way, they back him into a corner to admit that, yeah, of course, we're all complicit in the industrial paradigm. All right, I'm just going to do this much more. So that essay was published in 1980. There's my picture of the two of them. Abbey saying, no women? Really? No? And here's what he says at the beginning of that famous essay. In my ammo can, the river runner's handbag, I carry a worn and greasy paperback copy of a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods. Not for 30 years have I looked inside the book. Now for the first time since my school days I shall. That can't be true. Either he has the greatest memory in the history of modern literature, or he has looked at Walden many times, because you cannot possibly have that many close echoes of Thoreau in a 1980 essay and also in Desert Solitaire and claim that you haven't opened the book for 30 years. So there's a lot of posturing in Edward Abbey for effect, for literary effect. All right, so I'm just going to do one more here. He talks about, here we go. All that is human melted with the sky and faded out beyond the mountains, and I felt as I feel. Is it a paradox that a man can never find or need better companionship than that of himself? Abbey Solitaire. Here's what Thoreau wrote about this. I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company even with the best is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. A man thinking and working is always alone, let him be where he will. Solitude is not measured by the miles of space that intervene between a man and his fellows. The really diligent student in one of the crowded hives of Harvard, of Cambridge College, is as solitary as a dervish in the desert. You see how he took this? Inspired by, in some ways coded by, our man. So I'm not going to go through any more of this, but there's so much more to tell. You'll have to wait for my essay. And here again is my portrait of this extraordinary man. So just to summarize, Abbey is a complicated person. To lock him into Abbey the anarchist is a profound mistake. He's that too. Abbey invented monkey wrenching, but he didn't actually do much of it. A few billboards here and there and some beer cans. But he didn't like the idea of hurting other people. Abbey says, and this is the part that I'm finding most intriguing and difficult and kind of haunting to me, he has this obsession with being the lone man, but he was almost never alone very long. He got himself to town. There was always a woman on the edge of the periphery somewhere, possibly his wife. Abbey says that he loves Thoreau, but he abuses Thoreau for not being a full enough, vibrant man's man. But he is deeply indebted to Thoreau. He doesn't always acknowledge it. I don't think that matters. I think it shows the deepest linear tradition in American literature of this sort of theme. And so Abbey, after Walden, is the next great expression of those views. And all of the themes of anti-industrialism in Walden and anti-urbanism and belief in solitude and belief that the more time that we spend alone, the more our souls will grow and that we need to limit our material intakes and so on. All those themes that Thoreau, in a certain sense, invents in American culture, Abbey's picking up more than 100 years later and producing another classic that's similar but different, and one that I really, really, really urge you to read in the next few months. If you look at the paper, and I'm not saying a political thing here, the public lands are what Abbey thought as not only our refuge for our souls, but he also said in one of the wilder passages in Desert Solitaire, when the nation collapses, we're going to need to be able to go there and be survivors out there. That's going to be the refuge land that we go to when the whole thing turns to crap. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Clay Jenkinson.
All right, let's do it.
Boy, do I feel lucky to have the backyard that we have here.
Indeed you do.
Well, you all know Clay, and Clay knows you, so I'll spare some of the logistics. I'll bring the microphone around. Please speak directly into it. And for those of you who are here, when Abbey was here, feel free to share a story. If Abbey's meant something to your life, feel free to share a story.
And if people disagree with this reading of Abbey, I want to hear it.
Indeed. Who's going to get us started? Oh, quickly, if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom dashboard. Gary, start us off.
After listening to your talk, I wonder if he inspired the Earth Liberation Front, or the people that burned down Two Elk and did all the other fires around the country. They never hurt anybody. They only destroyed a lot of property.
So many of these organizations, Earth First and others, were deeply inspired by Abbey, but interestingly, they seldom invoke him. So they were influenced by him, but they really don't want to be taken into that vortex. But there is clearly, well, some of this would have happened anyway, of course. It doesn't depend upon Edward Abbey. But there's clearly an inspiration that Monkey Wrench Gang, it's kind of abused as a novel these days. I read it just last week again, and I actually really liked it. I thought it was quite a fine novel. He's quite a fine novelist, but it's not Great Expectations. It's not Moby Dick. It's not Huckleberry Finn, you know. It's not Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's a good enough novel, but it's a novel as a carrier of ideas. And so he has been branded as an advocate of violent property damage and beyond because of it, which was part of the celebrity that brought him here. You know, we didn't bring him here because he was a good writer. We brought him here, I presume, because he was Edward Abbey. And I think we're going to hear from someone who was there that he stole the show. But I think there's a connection, but there isn't an acknowledgement in most of these organizations. Other questions?
Yes, could you just mention a bit about his background? How did this creature get developed? You know, what was his childhood? Where did he go to school? Were his parents? Was he, and his son still alive? And
I assume you use creature in a positive sense. He was born in 1927 in the Appalachians of Pennsylvania. His father was a working class man, semi-anarchistic. He graduated high school in Pennsylvania. Then between then and college, he decided to make a trip, a kind of Kerouacian trip out into the American West. And he went to a number of Western states, including Utah and Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico. And he had what I suppose we'd call a Pauline conversion experience. He said, oh my goodness, this is it. This is the most extraordinary landscape in America. There's a spiritual landscape here. This fulfills me in a way that nothing in the East has fulfilled me. And so then he went to join the army for a couple of years, went to Italy, came back. He got a BA from the University of New Mexico, and then he worked for a while, went back to New Jersey. There were all sorts of relationship issues. And then he came back and got an MA from the University of New Mexico. And then he stayed out here for the rest of his life. And one of the interesting things about it is that he, like Thoreau, he never really had a job. You know, Thoreau, there are a whole set of slides here where Thoreau writes about his ideal job description. And he says, well, I'm a keeper of the wild stock of the town. He says, I water the huckleberries. And how do you water huckleberries? I think we know. So it's all this playful. And he says, and after this list of about 12 of his job descriptions, you know, I watch for the storms. I'm the best weatherman they ever saw. He says, and I just can't get Thoreau. This is now, and Thoreau, after this long and parodic satirical passage, says, and I just don't understand why they won't give me a pension for this. Why won't Concord pay me to do this? Somebody needs to be doing these things. I do them. Yeah, I'll do them free. Then he says, and for many years I kept a journal, and he makes it sound like a newspaper. For many years I was the editor of a journal, but nobody ever seemed to want to publish it. He's talking about his own great journal. And you remember, he only published, this is Thoreau, only published 2 books in his lifetime. A Week on the Concord and Mariette River, which sold nothing, and Walden, which was not well regarded. And Thoreau was not regarded as the great Thoreau until the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He was rediscovered in my lifetime and became the Thoreau, you know, almost the colossal Thoreau. But when his first book, they printed 900 copies, and the printers sold less than 200. And then they brought all the rest of them and put them on his doorstep. And he then quipped, I have one of the largest libraries in Massachusetts, 700 of which I wrote myself. So then Abbey now becomes a creature of the West. And he worked as a temp ranger at different parks and monuments. Then he got an even better gig. He worked as a fire lookout, where you spend the whole summer doing nothing unless there's a fire, and he loved that. And so all of his life he was, in a certain sense, at the trough of the federal government so that he could abuse the federal government at every turn. So there's a little of Thoreau in that too, a refusal to take an actual job. He did work a little bit. He worked as a social service clerk in New Jersey, but most of the money that he ever made came from these temp jobs. And he was poor. I mean, really poor to the point of being evicted from apartments in Albuquerque, poor to the point of furniture being repossessed. And he does say, you know, he's not without a heart. He says, my wives, plural, says, my wife suffered grievously because I couldn't support them. I never was able to earn enough money to support them. And of course, we would say, well, you didn't really ever get a job either, but then when he wrote Desert Solitaire, his reputation soared, and then he was never rich, but he had no significant poverty thereafter. And then he died in 1989. He was 62 years old, terribly young for such a great man, a genius. And he wanted to be buried in the most obscure sort of landscape, and he was secretly buried in one of the most remote desert wildlife refuges on the Arizona-Mexican border. And now there's kind of a cottage industry of people that try to find the grave. But his friends planted false grave markers all over the place and so on because he wanted to be left alone. And his grave epitaph was no comment. Other questions? Who has other questions? He died from some sort of a cardiovascular thing. He was a heavy smoker. He drank way too much. His liver was damaged. And so he died of I think, heart disease, basically. A couple more questions, yes.
He was also a university professor at University of Arizona. He taught writing and English. And I think the students absolutely were baffled by him.
Yes.
You know, because he had them read obscure things, and he said obscure things, but I think that was a wonderful thing. And he did come here, and I did very briefly meet him.
And tell us.
In 1976, he was here with Robert Redford, and it was the Vail Symposium, when we did the Vail Symposium as part of our work for the town of Vail.
And did you had any impression from then? It's a long time ago.
He was very tall. But then if you see me, everybody's very tall. But he had a demeanor that just carried questioning. He was questioning all the time, not heavily critical. He was kind enough for his speaking engagement.
Did he? I won't ask if he hit on you, but he hit on everybody. So he was a shy man. He was actually quite a shy and retiring man. And when he wasn't presenting, when he wasn't in his holding forth his theatrical mode, he was very decent, very quiet, very shy, and not at all the Abbey that we sort of have mythologized. Yes, he was a university professor, and the thing about Abbey as a university professor, not only was he bewildering, but he refused to read or grade their essays. And so the administration they finally said, I'm sorry, Mr. Abbey, but it doesn't quite work that way. And so he left one teaching gig in the East in I think it was North Carolina, in midterm, just said, no, I'm done. And so that doesn't usually lead to more teaching gigs.
Clay, we have an online question. Is there a modern Abbey or Thoreau?
Is there a modern Abbey? Well, there are plenty of great. Gretel Ehrlich is great. There are lots of terrific nature writers and nature advocates. I think Amy Irvine is a very significant writer. Yes, there are such, but there's nobody that has rung the bell the way he did. I'm talking about Abbey, not Thoreau here. There can be no Thoreau, in my view. That's it. He's a black swan. There can be no, because he's a transcendentalist. He's interested in Eastern mysticism. He's incredibly witty. He's one of the great describers of nature in all of literature anywhere. He engaged in this experiment, and I haven't even talked about the experiment. I'll come back to that in just a moment, because that's how everybody misreads Walden. But there are more people that could be said to be in the tradition of Abbey, and of course there are hundreds and thousands that wish they were Abbey and write and don't quite get the press or the notoriety of Edward Abbey. But yes, there are people that I think I could make you a list of people, but I wouldn't start there. I would start with Desert Solitaire and Confessions of a Barbarian, and I think if you read those, you'll think, okay, I want to know a lot more about this guy. And there are several really good biographies, and I'll give you some titles, and you can put them on the website of the Vail Symposium.
We can put them in a follow-up email to
Right,
everyone.
of course.
Yeah.
You alluded to this earlier, but did Abbey ever acknowledge the indigenous people? And if not, why not? For someone who, is really trying to, be at one with nature and the wilderness and the desert, there were other people who were at one with that nature, and why would he ignore that?
This is a hard question. There is an answer, but I'm going to be really careful talking about this, because I hate to perpetuate any of the things that he said in this respect. So in Desert Solitaire, there are 2 chapters called Cowboys and Indians. And in the first chapter, he's unrelentingly hard on Native Americans. Alcoholism, homelessness, unemployment, laziness, the whole 9 yards. And it's excruciating to read the first chapter, Cowboys and Indians. And at that point you wonder, today at the time it wouldn't have seemed as awful, but it was. And when I last read it, I wanted to put down the book, and I thought maybe this means I just can't read this book, because it's just so easy to be that way and stereotyping in that way. He's looking at the Navajo at a particularly difficult time in their history. He sees a lot of broken indigenous people in Moab and elsewhere. Albuquerque. And it's really, really troubling. And then I read the second chapter, and my friend Susan, who's here tonight, who is an archaeologist, and I had a 3-hour Zoom meeting where we talked every passage through. And this is a much, much, much better, more sensitive, more interesting, more nuanced view. And in that side, he says, they were here first. We should not make them angelic, but we should understand that they had a life way that would be in our interest to listen to. It's a really extraordinary second chapter, and then you sort of wonder, well, what's that really about? Why did he do this yin-yang approach to this? But the second chapter, and talking with an actual archaeologist who really knows what she's doing about ancestral people of the Southwest, and looking at these passages, a lot of it was extraordinarily insightful in the second chapter. So one thing just to say about that is Desert Solitaire is not fully integrated as a book. It turns out that it became a little bit of a grab bag for some things that he had been writing, and it doesn't really all quite fit. And so it's great, but it's a little uneven in that respect. He probably would have evolved if he had lived longer, but he saw this. I mean, I went to the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate, and I lived on Franklin Avenue, not far from the Native American part of the community. And every day I walked to the university and saw indigenous people passed out in the street and so on. And it's so easy if you're not thoughtful to say, look at that. And we have to not do that, of course. It was a desperate time in Minnesota because this was the relocation era when natives were plucked off of reservations and moved to Los Angeles and Seattle and Chicago and Minneapolis and so on without a proper set of supports, and just told your life will be better here, because this was when, I don't know if you remember this, but this was the termination period when President Eisenhower and others, including Richard Nixon, at first wanted to terminate all the reservations because they thought, until you terminate them, natives won't fully assimilate. And so this was one of the cruelest things we ever did as public policy, but we still do that sort of thing. But so you see an intoxicated native, and then you think, yep. And being enlightened means, and this is why we get educated. This is why we educate ourselves. Being educated means you get beyond the stereotypes, you get beyond the inherited mythologies. You begin to crack out the things you've been told or the things you think you see. Because when I'm from North Dakota, and there's a Mandan, Hidatsa, Ojibwe, Lakota, Assiniboine natives there, and so I knew a fair amount as a white outsider in that time. And so when I saw somebody who was suffering in that way from alcoholism, from homelessness, from desperation, I wasn't seeing that as if I were a pure observer from outer space. I was seeing that as somebody who had grown up being encoded all of my life with views of this thing. And I don't want to get into this, but when I was in high school, when the ration checks came out on a certain time of the year, and I'm not joking about this, the used car dealers in my hometown, Dickinson, North Dakota, would raise the price of all of their used cars to just under the ration check amount. Just naked, corrupt exploitation. So I carried my parents taught me to see better than that. But I carried a lot of baggage with me, and we all carried a lot of baggage with us, and being fully educated, and that's what the Vail Symposium exists to do for us as adults. It helps us to overcome the easy, sloppy stuff we carry around, and we are all so heavily encoded on almost everything, on gender, on race, on economics, etc. So Abbey was prone to that. He was kind of an urban redneck in some ways, but he was also better than that. And so you could read Desert Solitaire as an interesting developmental book about two ways that one extraordinary man saw this situation. But he saw a lot of suffering. And in the first chapter, he said, that's who they are. And in the second chapter, he said, no, that's what we have made them in our time. And so I urge you to read it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. I know we're just about out of time. We have a couple more if you have just a moment.
Do you have one? Okay.
Here's one.
Pardon me?
Does that make sense about the baggage we carry without knowing it?
I'm curious about what kind of anarchist he was and his criticisms of the national park. And like you said, he kind of lived off the federal government. So, how does his anarchy views fit with that?
Well, let me just clarify. He didn't live off the federal government. He wasn't on welfare. He was doing work, contract work. Somebody needs a fire ranger on such and such a mountain, a job. He applied for it. He was good at it, and he took it. But why he took it was that you don't have to work very hard for the summer, but somebody has to do that job, and then he could write, and he could read, and he could do all the other things that he most loved to do. So I don't think that's living off the federal government, but I do think it's a paradox of being so dependent on the national park system and the public land system, and then abusing it in the way that he did. But I think that kind of criticism is really important too. And I think, at the time, when you see the numbers in the national parks in the 1960s when he was doing this, it was not yet the crazy, even the beginning of the craziness that we now experience. I was at Glacier National Park last year. Not only long lines, but you must register weeks in advance, and you must reserve your time, and if you miss it, you're done, and so on. And in some ways, that seems to destroy the very idea of going to the national parks if you need a reservation. But we have no choice because of the fact that we're loving them to death. His criticism was that the national parks. I urge you all to look at the Organic Act from 1916, because there's a fundamental paradox built into it. It says we must preserve these special lands forever, and we must make them available to the American public. And those things wind up not being compatible or barely compatible. And so this is, I give great credit to the national park system, because they have to wrestle with this. And the senators from Utah and Colorado and Nevada are saying, you've got to make this available. You've got to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. How dare you try to close the parks? How dare you have, there's a lot of backlash on this, and they have to face this because it involves funding and so on. And so they have one mission that says, make this available to the people. And another mission says that preserve it forever from the wrong kind of development. And those they turn out to be incompatible, or nearly so. And so his critique was, it's 1968 and it was already pretty bad. There were no reservations. There were no long lines anywhere. And there's just a lot of cars. Now, it is really the case that there are endless lines, and people just literally can't get into the parks. And the amount of human disruption. And do you remember when the pandemic came and they closed Yosemite? And like 3 weeks later, the mountain lions were coming down and the bears were coming down, and all these creatures were like, thank God Almighty, they finally left. And they began to reclaim the parks almost immediately. And then, of course, the pandemic ended. But the parks can't be what they're supposed to be with 1.8 million people driving through them per year. In what sense is that a sanctuary for a mountain lion or an owl? And so this is really, really hard. And I really give a lot of credit to the National Park Service for valiantly trying to comply with its mission statements. And then what Abbey saw then was the coming of this sort of Campaign 66. And that meant there was going to be, it was typical 60s, there was going to be just a wholesale infrastructural development of the parks. And he thought, that's the death of them. That's going to be the death of the parks. And so I think he was right. And I think that if we had one of those gizmos in Men in Black where we could blank out your minds, which would be good for all sorts of things, and then when you came back into consciousness, all national parks had no cars in them. That it just was, and you didn't know there'd ever been another time. We'd get used to it. We'd accept it. Things would be much better in many respects. But because I'm the worst offender. I have cabins near Yellowstone, and when I drive in and think, I could get in a bus and go along. I just want that American freedom that, and we all, I think, feel that at times. And And so there's going to be heavy resistance to this. But if we didn't know any better, I think we would just love the parks even more because we would see wildlife and less honking. And, you know, when I'm in Yellowstone, even in the Lamar Valley, which is one of the least obsessively trafficked, if somebody thinks they see a bear at a mile away, there's a traffic jam for a quarter of a mile on both sides of the road. And then people are getting out and wandering as close as they can get. And the rangers come along and say, you know, I have to sort out this pretzel. And if you're trying to get to Madison Junction, you better plan for a couple of more hours, because if anybody sees anything that they think is a critter, it's just, the whole world just stops. And then everyone's, I think, is that Raspberry the bear? And there's this whole cult of people naming things, which I find just odious. You know, human beings naming a grizzly bear as like they have a cousinship with it. Oh, that's Rosemary, I can tell, because she has a little silver in her hair. That's sort of that, when we, and this is what Abbey is against, and he says, we anthropomorphize nature. We ascribe human qualities to nature, and when we do that, we damage its capacity to be whole and to be different from human expectations. So I just want to say this. If you have never read Desert Solitaire or haven't read it lately, I think it's going to be a great primer for the next 4 years. And I don't mean that in any snarky political sense. I mean that if you believe in the public lands, which has been a struggle over more than a century to create national parks, thank you Theodore Roosevelt, national monuments, national wildlife refuges, national forests, national wilderness, national game preserves, and so on, the BLM, the Forest Service, etc. If you believe that settlement that happened between, let's say, Roosevelt's time in 1909 until around 1980, that this kind of, we created this system in America. And I think we all thought it was permanent, that it was a final kind of wonderful settlement, that these lands would be forever inviolable. And you could do some work on the BLM lands and so on and so forth, but they would always be there, and there would never be a heavy attempt to disintegrate that system. You can see that there is one, and the people that want to do that have a legitimate point of view. They believe resources are there, that we've locked up too much, that there's too intrusive a national government, that these lands were not meant to be permanently, and so on. There is a point of view, and I think we have to grant it some agency. But if we think that we can just shrug our shoulders and think that this whole system is going to be intact if we don't learn about it and think about it and ask hard questions of ourselves and each other about the future, I think there's a very good possibility that we're going to lose what Ken Burns called the world's best idea, America's public lands. So thank you very much. Thank you so.
Clay Jenkinson.